are Abe Cast Iron Brains, a podcast that has remained steadfastly disinterested in the recent local kerfuffle over the renaming of the neighborhood elementary school. But if this podcast was going to have an opinion about such matters, which, to be clear, this podcast does not, the opinion would be, why not just leave well enough alone? The school isn't named for a former Confederate general or even a slave-owning founding father, but for a man who served as superintendent of schools for 35 years, ending in 1946. The worst that can reasonably be said of him is that during a time in which school segregation and the bogus doctrine of separate but equal were the law of the land, he maintained the status quo, that he was no moral hero, working publicly to dismantle the institutions of white supremacy writ upon the local school system of which he was the leader, but just another leave well enough alone coward who, if he knew any better, didn't tell anyone. But of course, as is the case with any marginal local figure who died years before this podcast's parents were born, his name is but an abstraction, disconnected from any person or anything he did, and just a proper noun for the building and general property around that building, the administration of which is currently handled by at least equally well-meaning people actually living today who, no doubt, hold all manner of beliefs that this podcast, and certainly our coming morally superior posterity, might find abhorrent, or at least discomfiting. But again, this podcast has preferred to remain steadfastly disinterested in even having the conversation, if for no reason but the simple fact that this podcast does not care enough in either direction to warrant raising a voice. That the act of voicing an opinion would be to tell a lie about how much this podcast cares about such matters. That the default to leave well enough alone isn't a statement of an inherently conservative position, but simply leaving space for the possibility that making this a thing could itself be doing more harm than good in either direction. That speaking up on a question that is perhaps well-intentioned but misguided in the very asking is to assent to play an absurd game that need not be played, a game in which one side insists that measurable harms can be undone with an act of historical erasure, and the other side insists that an act of historical erasure will enact measurable harms on them. A conclusion drawn not from a flawed premise, but from the ether, from nothing at all, a conclusion that both sides agree is definitely the case, not just without evidence, but in the face of evidence directly to the contrary, that allows them to continue living their lives despite all the things they don't know or have forgotten about, all the ways the universe has conspired to deprive them of themselves for countless millennia. But the school will be renamed, because enough people think it will do meaningful good, or at least no harm, and fewer people want to be seen raising a stink from what is, by default, the racist position. And the vast majority either can't be bothered to care or, like this podcast, think that even speaking up would be giving in to an absurdist, important conversation that has all the utility of very meaningfully agonizing over which way around a dead body you're going to step, paralyzed in deep thought in front of the rotting corpse as putrefaction sets in and the fluids start leaking towards your sneakers, where the simple answer is to step right over that dead body and leave well enough alone. Never mind that the school will now be named after the street to which it sits adjacent, a street that likely got its name from the cherry blossom trees that adorn the National Mall, trees that would not be there, gifted by Japan, but for the efforts of one dedicated woman, First Lady of the United States, and her husband's closest advisor, Helen Herron Taft. Taft's husband, William Howard Taft, is largely regarded as an ineffectual and undistinguished president, but he also had some rather reprehensible views. Looking back on them with the benefit of modern moral clarity, Taft wrote in 1906 that there wasn't much of a problem with Jim Crow laws that disenfranchised the black vote because blacks weren't ready to use the vote intelligently yet. Anyway, quote, "When a class of persons is so ignorant and so subject to oppression and misleading that they are merely political children, not having the mental stature of manhood, then it can hardly be said that their voice in the government secures any benefit to them." End quote. This attitude of paternalism and imperialism probably had little or even nothing to do with Taft's wife's advocacy to bring the cherry trees to Washington, D.C. from Japan, but it is, nevertheless, part of the whole story. And that story will now be told, whether aloud or just in the atmosphere of the place, in perpetuity on down through the generations, as a few hundred school children pass by the sign of their newly named school every day. Unless, of course, we all just leave well enough alone. My name is Bob, sitting across the way from my good friend and co-host. That's Abe. How you doing tonight, Abe?
Doing well.